The crystal chandelier above the ballroom of the Gilded Heights did more than just light the room. It acted as a silent witness to the exact moment the air left the lungs of 300 of the city's most dangerous and influential people. You're bleeding on the silk, girl. Do you have any idea what this costs, or does your brain only function in tips and crumbs? The voice was a razor blade dipped in honey. It belonged to Elena Vane, the woman the entire city whispered about in hushed, terrified tones. Elena, the fiancée of the notorious Julian Thorne, stood in the center of the gala, her designer gown shimmering like oil on water. She wasn't just the future wife of a syndicate head. She was a woman who had systematically dismantled the reputations of anyone who dared to stand in her shadow. Beneath her, kneeling on the cold marble, was Clara Sterling. Clara's hands were steady, even as a shard of a broken champagne flute sliced into her palm, a scarlet drop staining the hem of Elena's ivory train. The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. To defend a waitress against Elena Vane was to invite a social, and potentially literal, death sentence. "I apologize, Miss Vane," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. It was low, melodic, and held a strange, rhythmic calm that made Julian Thorne, watching from the shadows with a drink in his hand, narrow his eyes. The tray was bumped. "I'll have a cleaning kit here in seconds." "A cleaning kit won't fix your incompetence," Elena sneered, leaning down so her perfume, something expensive and suffocating, filled Clara's senses. "You're a ghost and nothing. You exist to serve, not to stain. Look at me when I'm devaluing you." Clara lifted her head. For a moment the ghost and the queen locked eyes. In that split second, the facade Elena had spent 5 years building, the poise, the old money grace, the carefully curated charity matriarch persona, flickered. Claire didn't see a monster. She saw a fraud. She recognized the specific jagged way Elena's hand moved to her throat, a nervous tick she'd seen years ago in a very different setting under a very different name. Clara knew the truth. The woman everyone feared wasn't the architect of her own power. She was a thief of other people's lives. "I am looking at you, Miss Vane," Clara whispered, loud enough only for the woman in front of her to hear. "And I'm wondering if the people in this room know that your exclusive, vintage silk was actually a floor sample from the 2021 Hudson liquidation sale. The one with the invisible repair on the left seam. The one I personally tagged." Elena's face went from porcelain to ash in a heartbeat. The seed of a mystery had been planted, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from predatory to electric. The hunters were about to become the hunted. "Hello, my wonderful viewers. It is so good to have you back here today for a story that I promise will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last second. I'm so grateful for this community we've built together. Before we dive deeper into how Clara dismantles this tyrant, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I try to read as many as I can. And if you haven't already, please do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. It helps the channel immensely and ensures you never miss these stories of justice and redemption. How are you all doing today? I hope you're ready for a wild ride. The tension in the ballroom didn't just break, it curdled. Elena's hand flew to the seam Clara had mentioned, her fingers trembling. "How dare you?" Elena hissed, but the venom lacked its usual sting. It was replaced by a frantic, jagged edge of panic. "I dare because the truth doesn't require permission," Clara thought, though she kept her expression neutral, the perfect mask of a subservient worker. In that moment Julian Thorne stepped forward. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He was a man of cold violence and calculated silence, and he looked down at the waitress with a curiosity that was more dangerous than his anger. "Is there a problem here, Elena?" Julian asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just a clumsy girl, Julian," Elena said, her voice climbing an octave. She's delusional. She needs to be removed. Immediately." But Julian wasn't looking at the stain. He was looking at Clara's eyes. He saw something there he hadn't seen in years. Absolute, unadulterated fearlessness. "Wait," Julian said, his hand staying the security guard who had begun to move in. "I want to hear what the delusional girl has to say. She seems to know a lot about your dress, darling." The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Would the waitress who had nothing lose everything by speaking? Or was she the only person in the city brave enough to pull the thread that would unravel the most feared woman in the underground? The heavy silence of the ballroom felt like a physical weight, pressing against the lungs of everyone present. To anyone else, the gaze of Julian Thorne was a death warrant, but for Clara Sterling, it was merely a lens. For 3 years she had lived as a shadow in this city, a woman who moved through high-end galas and smoky backrooms with a silver tray and a lowered head. Her deepest desire wasn't wealth or even comfort. It was the restoration of a name that had been dragged through the mud by the very woman now trembling in silk. Clara's motivation wasn't born of a simple grudge. She carried the memory of her father, a man who had built one of the most prestigious event planning firms in the state, only to have his intellectual property stolen and his reputation decimated by an ambitious intern he had once trusted like a daughter. That intern had been Elena Vane, or as Clara remembered her, Ellie Vance. Seeing Elena now, draped in the spoils of her father's ruin, ignited a cold, steady flame in Clara's chest. Her fear of Julian Thorne was eclipsed by a much sharper fear, the fear that if she didn't act now, the truth would die with her father's fading memory. "She's a waitress, Julian." Elena's voice cracked, a tiny fissure in her icy facade. She reached out to touch Julian's arm, her diamonds catching the light, but for the first time he didn't lean into her. "She's clearly looking for a payout. This is a shakedown. Look at her, she's nothing." Julian Thorne was a man built on foundations of iron and secrets. He had risen to the top of the Thorne syndicate not through mindless brutality, but through a terrifyingly sharp intuition. He valued loyalty above all else, but he valued the truth even more. Mostly because the truth was the only currency that didn't devalue in his world. Standing beside him was his right-hand man, Elias Kale, a man with the face of a priest and the eyes of a shark. Elias watched Clara with a tilted head, his mind already cataloging her posture, her lack of a tell, and the way she didn't flinch when the security team loomed. "Nothing is a dangerous word, Elena," Elias whispered, his voice smooth and unsettling. "Nothings are the people who see everything because they are never invited to the conversation. They are the wallpaper that listens." The supporting cast of the evening, the criminal elites and their high society wives, began to murmur. Among them was Silas Vane, Elena's supposed aristocratic uncle, a man whose polished exterior hid a history of failed scams and desperate gambles. He stepped forward, trying to exert an authority he didn't truly possess. "This is an outrage. My niece's character is beyond reproach. She has raised millions for the orphanages of the North District. This girl is a common thief of reputation." Clara stood slowly, ignoring the sting of the glass in her hand. She remembered Silas. He wasn't an uncle. He was a former bookie who had helped Ellie Vance forge the credentials that landed her in Julian's orbit. The relationships in this room were a web of lies, and Clara held the scissors. "I don't want to pay out, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice projecting to the back of the hall. "I want to finish my shift. But if Miss Vane is concerned about the integrity of her charity work, perhaps we should talk about the Morning Star Foundation event last month. The one where the catering was donated by a firm that went bankrupt the following week because their invoices were never paid." The room grew even colder. Elena's breath hitched. That event had been her crowning achievement in the social columns. "You're lying." Elena screamed, the mask of the poised fiancé slipping further to reveal the jagged, desperate girl beneath. "I have the receipts." "I'm sure you do," Clara replied calmly. "But are they the receipts from the foundation, or the ones redirected to the Shell account registered under your uncle's former business address in the docks?" The stakes were no longer just about a stained dress. They were about the very foundation of the Thorne-Vane alliance. Julian looked at Elena, his expression unreadable, then back at Clara. He saw a woman who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from the truth. He saw a woman who knew the weight of every word she spoke. Behind the scenes, the tension was building. Clara's co-workers, other waitresses and busboys who had endured Elena's cruelty for months, watched from the kitchen doors. To them, Clara was the quiet one, the girl who worked double shifts and never complained. They didn't know her history, but they knew her heart. They knew she was the only one who had ever shared her tips with the dishwashers. Their silent support felt like a current of electricity flowing toward her. "What is your name?" Julian asked. "Clara," she said. "Just Clara." "For now, yes." Clara's deepest secret was that she wasn't just a waitress. She was the sole owner of the digital archives of Sterling and Company, her father's defunct firm. She had the original blueprints for every gala Elena had claimed as her own creation. She had the proof that the queen was a scavenger. But she couldn't reveal it all at once. She had to lead them into the trap, one inconsistent detail at a time. "Elias," Julian said, never taking his eyes off Clara. "Don't let anyone leave. And get this girl a bandage for her hand. If she's going to dismantle my fiancé's life, I'd prefer she didn't bleed on my floor while doing it." The invitation was clear. The floor was hers. But Clara knew that playing this game with the Mafia was like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. One wrong word, one slip in her logic and she wouldn't just be fired, she would vanish. Yet as she looked at Elena's panicked eyes, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The foundation was laid. The characters were in place. The city's queen was standing on a pedestal of glass, and Clara was holding the first stone. The air in the Gilded Heights ballroom transformed from stagnant luxury into a pressurized chamber. Julian Thorne's command to seal the doors echoed like a gavel, and the rhythmic clicking of the heavy brass locks sent a ripple of genuine terror through the socialites. This was no longer an engagement party. It was an interrogation. Elena Vane stood frozen, her fingers digging so deeply into her silk skirts that the fabric began to bunch in protest. "Julian, you cannot be serious," Elena managed, her voice trembling with a frantic, forced laughter that didn't reach her eyes. "You're listening to a girl who wipes tables. This is an insult to me, to our family, and to every guest here. Have her thrown out. Please." But Julian ignored her. He pulled out a chair from the nearest table, a table occupied by the city's commissioner and his wife, and gestured for Clara to sit. It was a gesture of profound disrespect toward the hierarchy of the room, and a terrifying signal of his shifting interest. "Sit, Clara," Julian said. It wasn't a request. Clara sat, her movements fluid and devoid of the frantic energy that was currently consuming Elena. As she sat, the heavy double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open one last time. A man entered, his presence demanding immediate attention. He was younger than Julian, with a wilder edge. Arthur Shelby, a notorious figure from a rival territory whose presence here was a calculated political move. He had been the one to bump the tray earlier, a move Clara now realized wasn't accidental. Arthur's eyes met Clara's, and for a fleeting second, a spark of recognition passed between them, not of friendship but of shared intent. He didn't sit. He leaned against a marble pillar, watching the spectacle with the grin of a man who loved to see a fire start. "I believe the lady mentioned the Morning Star Foundation," Arthur interjected, his voice carrying a rough, melodic grit. "Funny thing about that. I tried to donate a sizable sum to that foundation myself. My accountants told me the routing numbers led to a defunct textile mill in the North District. I thought it was just a clerical error. Now I'm wondering if it was a silk error." The room gasped. This was the inciting spark, the moment the private dispute became a public liability. If the Mafia's money was being funneled into Elena's private coffers without Julian's knowledge, it wasn't just a lie, it was a death-grade betrayal. "You're all in on this," Elena shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at Clara and then Arthur. "This is a setup. Julian, they're trying to weaken you by attacking me." Clara looked up, her gaze steady. "I don't know Mr. Shelby. I only know the ledgers. And I know that Miss Vane's untraceable charity work is actually a carbon copy of the Sterling and Company 2019 outreach plan. Even the font on the invitations tonight, Garamond 11 point with gold leaf embossing, is a signature move of a firm that no longer exists because it was bled dry from the inside." Julian leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Clara. "You have a lot of specific knowledge for a waitress, Clara. Why no? Why tonight?" "Because tonight is the only night you're all in one room," Clara said, the truth ringing clear as a bell. "And because tonight Miss Vane decided that my dignity was a price she was willing to pay for her own entertainment. She chose the wrong girl to humiliate." The first major plot twist hit the room like a physical blow. Clara reached into the hidden pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. It was her insurance policy, the black box of her father's destroyed legacy. "This drive contains the original digital signatures for the Morning Star blueprints," Clara said, holding it up. "If Miss Vane is who she says she is, she should have the matching master keys. After all, she claims she designed the entire initiative from scratch while she was studying in Europe." Elena's face went a ghostly shade of gray. She hadn't been in Europe. She had been in a cramped apartment 3 blocks away, using a stolen login to scavenge Clara's father's servers. I don't carry my keys to a party, Elena stammered, her eyes darting toward the exit, which was now blocked by Julian's men. I have a laptop in the office, Elias Kale said, appearing like a phantom at Julian's shoulder. The shark-eyed lieutenant was clearly enjoying the hunt. We can verify the signatures in 5 minutes. It's a simple matter of digital fingerprints. Unless, of course, there's a reason the fingerprints won't match. The tension reached a breaking point. Elena, realizing the walls were closing in, did the only thing a cornered predator could do: she attacked. She lunged across the table, not at the drive but at Clara's face, her nails aimed like talons. "You little bitch," she screamed, all pretension of elegance vanishing into a gutter-level rage. But she never reached her target. Arthur Shelby moved with a speed that startled even Julian's guards. He caught Elena's wrist mid-air, his grip tightening until she winced. "Careful, princess," Arthur whispered, his voice dangerously low. "The help is usually invisible, but this one is the most interesting thing in this room. I'd hate to see her damaged before she finishes her story." He released Elena, who stumbled back into the arms of her uncle Silas. Silas was sweating profusely, his eyes darting toward the windows. He knew the ship was sinking. Julian stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the marble. The decision was made. The central challenge was no longer about a stained dress. It was a trial of legitimacy. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something that wasn't coldness. It was respect. "If that drive shows what I think it shows," Julian said, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on the back of everyone's neck stand up, "then this engagement is over. And the debt Elena Vane owes to this city, and to me, will be paid in full." Clara felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of triumph and absolute terror. She had forced the hand of the most powerful man in the state. She had introduced the spark to the powder keg. The room was a sea of shocked faces, and at the center of it, the queen of the syndicate was beginning to look like a common thief caught in the act. "Check the drive, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice a beacon of calm in the storm. "And then ask her where she was on the night of October 14th, 3 years ago. Ask her why my father's heart stopped the same hour she signed her first contract with you." The revelation hung in the air, a final, devastating blow. This wasn't just about fraud anymore. It was about blood. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from a structured interrogation to a suffocating pressure cooker. While Elias Kale vanished into the side office with the thumb drive, the remaining guests were trapped in a gilded cage of their own making. Julian Thorne retreated to the head of the long banquet table, his silence more terrifying than any shout. He didn't look at Elena, who was currently being shielded by a trembling Silas. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Clara, who was now being tended to by a fellow waitress, a young girl named Sophie, who was nervously dabbing at Clara's cut hand with a linen napkin. "You're insane, Clara," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. "They're going to kill us both. You can't just accuse a woman like that of everything." "She isn't a woman like that, Sophie," Clara replied, her voice low but steady. "She's a mirage. And once you stop believing in a mirage, it loses its power to hurt you." As the minutes ticked by, Arthur Shelby remained a lingering shadow near the pillar. He watched the interplay between the Mafia boss and the waitress with a predatory curiosity. He wasn't just here for the chaos. He had his own stakes in the downfall of the Vane reputation. He stepped forward, bypassing the guards with a nonchalance that suggested he knew exactly how much weight his name carried in this room. He pulled a small silver flask from his coat, offering it toward Clara. "For the nerves, sweetheart," Arthur said, his eyes scanning her face for a crack in her resolve. "Or for the wound. Stings like hell, but it keeps the rot out." Clara took the flask, her fingers brushing against his. In that brief contact, there was a jolt of something unexpected, a spark of shared rebellion. Arthur wasn't a good man by any traditional metric, but in this den of polished monsters, his honesty about his own darkness was almost refreshing. She took a small sip, the liquid burning a path down her throat, and handed it back. "I'm not worried about the rot outside," Clara said. "I'm worried about the rot that's been sitting at the head of this table for 5 years. Arthur let out a dry, short laugh. "You've got a spine made of iron. I like that. Just remember, iron breaks if it doesn't bend when the wind blows. The romantic tension between the two was a sharp contrast to the cold fury radiating from Julian. Julian noticed the exchange, his jaw tightening. It was an insult to his ego. A rival boss flirting with the woman who was currently dismantling his life's choices. He stood up and paced the length of the marble floor, the click of his heels sounding like a countdown. "Elena," Julian said, his voice deceptively soft. "While we wait for Elias, why don't you tell the room about your uncle, Silas? I've been meaning to ask why a man of his supposed stature has 3 different social security numbers registered in the state of Nevada." The room erupted into a fresh wave of whispers. This was the red herring Elena had relied on. The idea that she came from a lineage of old-world European wealth. If Silas was a fraud, the entire foundation of the Thornvein merger was built on sand. He's had business interests everywhere, Julian. You know how the industry is, Elena stammered, her hands flying to her hair, trying to fix a stray strand that had escaped her perfect coiffure. "This waitress is a plant. She's working for Shelby. Look at them, they're practically whispering secrets already." Clara stood up, the movement drawing every eye back to her. "The only secret here, Miss Vane, is that you never actually graduated from the Sorbonne. You were working as a receptionist at a dental clinic in Queens while you claimed to be studying the classics in Paris. I have the employment records. You used my father's client list to find Julian, and you used my father's designs to impress him. But you forgot one thing. My father was a perfectionist. He left watermarks in his work. Small intentional errors that only he could identify. Errors that are present in every single event you've designed for the Thorne family." The obstacles were mounting. Silas tried to make a break for the service entrance, but 2 of Julian's men intercepted him, their hands heavy on his shoulders as they forced him back into a chair. The visual of the aristocrat being handled like a common thief was a turning point for the guests. The fear that had protected Elena was evaporating, replaced by a cruel, hungry curiosity. "Is it true, Elena?" An older woman, a major donor to Elena's charities, asked from across the room. "Did you use our money to buy those apartments in the North District? The ones you said were for the homeless, but are currently listed under a holding company." "No. It's all lies." Elena screamed, but her growth into a cornered animal was complete. She was no longer the queen. She was a girl caught with her hand in the jar, and the jar was filled with the blood of the city's elite. Clara felt a wave of exhaustion hit her, but she pushed through it. She saw Arthur watching her, his expression uncharacteristically serious. He saw the toll this was taking on her. He stepped closer, his presence a barrier between her and the increasingly volatile Elena. "You've done enough for one night, Clara," Arthur whispered. "The fire is lit. You don't need to stay in the room while it burns." "I have to see it through," Clara replied, her voice cracking for the first time. "For my father. He died thinking he was a failure because she stole his soul. I won't leave until she knows she couldn't keep it." The tension reached a crescendo as the office door finally creaked open. Elias Kale stepped out, his face a mask of cold, clinical efficiency. He held a stack of printed papers in one hand and the thumb drive in the other. He didn't look at Elena. He didn't look at Arthur. He walked straight to Julian and laid the papers on the table. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Clara had ever heard. It was the sound of a world ending. Julian began to read, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages. As he reached the bottom of the first sheet, his face transformed. The coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged betrayal that made even the hardened criminals in the room recoil. "October 14th, Julian whispered, the date Clara had mentioned earlier. "The night your father died, Clara. And the night Elena signed a life insurance policy, naming herself as the sole beneficiary of his creative estate, through a forged power of attorney." The final revelation of the part hit like a thunderbolt. Elena hadn't just stolen the work. She had bet on the death of the man she stole it from. The atmosphere in the ballroom shattered. It wasn't the loud, dramatic crash of a vase, but the sickening wet sound of a foundation collapsing into the mud. Julian Thorne stood frozen, the papers in his hand trembling, not from fear but from a rage so concentrated it seemed to darken the air around him. The queen of the syndicate was no longer a title Elena Vane wore. It was a noose she had tied herself. A power of attorney, Julian whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal frequency. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Elena with a predatory focus that made several guests near her physically back away. You didn't just find me, Elena. You didn't just happen to be the brilliant mind I needed to rebrand the Thorn image. You targeted a dying man, stole his legacy, and then used his daughter's inheritance to buy your way into my bed. Julian, no. That paper is a forgery. She's a waitress, she's a nobody, she could have made that on a home printer. Elena's voice was a shrill, desperate claws-on-chalkboard screech. She looked around the room, pleading with the very people she had spent years belittling. Silas, tell him we were in Paris. Tell him about the firm. But Silas Vane was gone. In the shadow of the revelation, the uncle had realized the game was over. He had slipped toward the back of the room, only to be stopped by the heavy, silent presence of Elias Cale's subordinates. There was no escape. The charade had reached its terminal point. Clara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment she had dreamed of for 3 years, yet the victory felt heavy, coated in the ash of her father's memory. She looked at Julian, seeing the man for who he truly was, a powerful, dangerous figure who had been played for a fool. It wasn't just the money, Mr. Thorne, Clara said, her voice cutting through Elena's hysterics with a sharp, surgical precision. Check the second page of the digital log. The power of attorney wasn't signed in an office. It was signed at St. Jude's Hospital in the ICU at 3:14 a.m. My father was in a medically induced coma at 3:14 a.m. He couldn't have signed a grocery list, let alone a legal transfer of his life's work. The room gasped as Julian flipped the page. The digital timestamp was undeniable. It was the game-changing twist that shifted the story from a matter of social fraud to a criminal conspiracy of the highest order. Julian's hand went to the heavy signet ring on his finger, a habit he had when he was deciding who lived and who died. But that isn't the most interesting part, is it, Elias? Julian asked, his voice dripping with a terrifying calmness. Elias Cale stepped forward, his shark-like eyes glinting. No, sir. The most interesting part is the source of the seed money Elena used to buy her first set of designer clothes and the fake credentials. We traced the wire transfers back through 3 shell companies. The original source wasn't the Sterling estate. It was a private account belonging to the Moretti family. A collective intake of breath hissed through the ballroom. The Morettis were Julian Thorne's blood rivals, the family responsible for the hit that had killed his older brother 5 years ago. The revelation hit the room like a physical explosion. Elena wasn't just a fraud. She was a plant. She was a Trojan horse sent by the Thorne Syndicate's greatest enemies to sit at the right hand of the king, draining his resources and learning his secrets under the guise of love. The romantic connection Julian thought he had built with her wasn't just a lie. It was a weapon used against him. Elena's knees finally gave out. She collapsed onto the marble floor, the ivory silk of her dress fanning out around her like a broken wing. The woman who had terrorized the city's elite was now a shivering pile of terrified humanity. I had no choice, she sobbed, the aristocratic accent she had carefully cultivated vanishing, replaced by the rough, desperate tones of the Queen's receptionist she had once been. They were going to kill me, Julian. The Morettis. They found out about the Sterling files I stole. They said if I didn't get close to you, if I didn't feed them your schedules, they'd do to me what they did to your brother. Julian's face went completely blank. It was the look of a man who had left the world of the living. He walked slowly toward her, his shadow stretching across her like a shroud. You fed them my brother's memory? He asked. You sat at my table, wore the diamonds I bought you, and talked about legacy, while you were reporting back to the men who bled my family dry? In that moment of absolute darkness, Julian turned to Clara. The vulnerability in his eyes was staggering. He had been betrayed by the person he trusted most, and the only person who had told him the truth was a waitress he had intended to humiliate. The romantic tension that had been brewing between Clara and Arthur Shelby suddenly felt complicated by a new heavy connection between the protagonist and the boss. Julian saw in Clara the integrity he had lacked, the strength to stand alone against a lie. And you, Julian said, looking at Clara. You knew all of this. You knew she was a Moretti shadow. I didn't know about the Morettis, Clara said, her voice softening. I only knew she was a thief. I only knew she killed my father's spirit. The rest, That's the rot I told you about. Rot always spreads, Mr. Thorne. It never stays in one corner. Arthur Shelby stepped out from the shadows, his hand resting on the hilt of a concealed blade. He looked at Julian, then at Clara. The stakes were at their highest point yet. If Julian reacted with his usual brutality, the night would end in a bloodbath. But if he listened to the waitress, the woman who had dismantled a tyrant with facts instead of bullets, everything could change. The question now, Thorne, Arthur said, his voice a low challenge, is what you do with a queen who's actually a spy. And what you do with a waitress who's actually the smartest person in this room. The revelation of Elena's true allegiance had turned the engagement party into a battlefield. The city's queen was exposed as a traitor, and the quiet waitress had become the arbiter of justice. The ballroom, once a sanctuary of light and status, suddenly felt like a tomb. As the weight of Elena's betrayal and her connection to the Moretti family settled over the room, the power flickered. A low rhythmic thud began to echo from the floor below, the sound of heavy boots. The darkest hour didn't arrive with a whimper. It arrived with the sound of breaching charges. The heavy oak doors that Elias had locked were blown inward with a deafening roar. Smoke and dust choked the air, turning the crystalline beauty of the gilded heights into a gray, suffocating wasteland. Through the haze, men in tactical gear, not Julian's men, swarmed the room. These were the Moretti enforcers. They weren't there to rescue Elena. They were there to silence the witnesses of her failure and eliminate the head of the Thorne Syndicate while he was vulnerable. Get down. Arthur Shelby's voice cut through the chaos. He didn't hesitate. He lunged toward Clara, throwing his heavy wool coat over her and shoving her beneath the reinforced mahogany of the head table just as the first volley of gunfire shattered the remaining champagne towers. The separation was instant and terrifying. Clara was pinned in the darkness beneath the table, the scent of expensive cigars and spilled wine filling her nose. Through the gaps in the tablecloth, she saw the world she had just tried to fix dissolve into a nightmare. Julian Thorne had been pulled behind a marble pillar by Elias, his face a mask of cold fury as he drew a weapon from an ankle holster. Elena, the woman who had caused this collapse, was screaming, abandoned in the center of the floor as the Morettis ignored her, their sights set only on Julian. Julian! Help me! Elena shrieked, her voice cracking as a bullet sparked off the marble inches from her head. But Julian didn't move for her. He looked toward the table where Clara was hidden, his eyes searching for the waitress who had held the mirror up to his life. In that moment, Clara saw the insurmountable obstacle. She had sought justice, but she had brought a war. Every person in this room was now a target because she had chosen tonight to speak. The guilt hit her harder than the shockwave of the explosion. The situation appeared utterly hopeless. The Moretti enforcers had the high ground of the balcony, and Julian's security team was outnumbered. To make matters worse, a fire had started near the heavy velvet curtains, the flames licking the ceiling and casting demonic shadows across the carnage. "Stay here, Clara," Arthur hissed, his hand gripping her shoulder one last time before he moved to engage a shooter nearing their position. "If you move, you die. Do you understand?" "Arthur, wait." Clara reached out, but he was gone, a shadow merging with the smoke. Left alone in the dark, Clara confronted her deepest fear, that she was exactly what Elena had called her, a nothing whose interference had only caused more death. She looked at her bleeding hand, the bandage Sophie had applied now soaked through with red. She thought of her father. He had been a man of peace, a man of beauty. He would have hated this. He would have told her that the truth is a fire, and if you don't know how to contain it, it burns the innocent with the guilty. From her vantage point, she saw Elena crawl toward the exit, her ivory dress now blackened and torn. But the exit was blocked by a Moretti commander, a man with a scarred face who looked down at Elena with pure disgust. "You failed, Ellie," the commander growled, his voice audible in a momentary lull of gunfire. "The instructions were simple. Keep him distracted. Instead, you let a servant strip you naked in front of the city. You're of no use to the family now." He raised his weapon. Elena's eyes went wide, her mouth opening in a silent plea. Clara felt a surge of desperation. Despite everything Elena had done, despite the theft of her father's soul, Clara couldn't watch her be executed in cold blood. It wasn't about mercy for Elena. It was about Clara refusing to let the darkness win. She looked around the underside of the table and saw a heavy silver ice bucket filled with half-melted cubes and a magnum of champagne. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, Clara kicked the bucket out from under the table. It slid across the slick marble floor, colliding with the commander's boots just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, shattering a mirror behind Elena. "Who's there?" the commander roared, turning his attention toward the table. Clara's heart stopped. She was exposed. The commander began to walk toward her hiding spot, his boots crunching on the glass. Every step felt like a second taken off her life. She realized then that Julian and Arthur were pinned down on the opposite side of the room. There was no one to save her. She closed her eyes, clutching the thumb drive, the only evidence of the truth, to her chest. She had dismantled a tyrant, but the tyrant's masters were coming to finish the job. She was a waitress in a war zone, a ghost in a burning house. The silence of the room, save for the crackling fire and the heavy footsteps of the man coming to kill her, was the most profound despair she had ever known. In this darkest hour, the connection she had felt to Arthur and the strange respect she had earned from Julian seemed like a lifetime ago. She was alone. She was the nothing again. And as the tablecloth was ripped away, revealing her huddled form to the barrel of a gun, Clara Sterling finally understood the true cost of the truth. The barrel of the commander's weapon looked like a bottomless black pit. Clara stared into it, her breath hitching in her throat. The smoke from the burning curtains swirled around the man's head like a halo of ash. He sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger, ready to erase the woman who had inadvertently ruined the Moretti family's long-game investment. But as the hammer clicked, a flash of movement erupted from the periphery. It wasn't a bullet that saved her but a heavy, solid silver platter. It sailed through the air with the precision of a discus, striking the commander's wrist with a sickening crack. He bellowed in pain, his weapon skittering across the floor. Clara looked up and saw Sophie, the shy, trembling waitress from earlier, standing by the service entrance, her face pale but her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce courage. "Leave her alone," Sophie screamed, her voice cracking but resolute. That split second of distraction was all the opening Julian Thorne and Arthur Shelby needed. They moved in a synchronized blur of violence. Arthur vaulted over a fallen sofa, his blade finding the gap in the commander's tactical vest, while Julian provided cover fire that forced the remaining Moretti gunmen back into the foyer. The tide hadn't just turned, the water was beginning to boil. Arthur grabbed Clara, hauling her to her feet and shielding her body with his own. "I told you to stay down, you stubborn girl," he growled, though his eyes checked her for injuries with a frantic intensity that betrayed his rough tone. "But I suppose a girl who starts a revolution isn't very good at following orders." "The drive," Clara gasped, holding it up. "They wanted the drive, Arthur. It's not just about the money anymore. The Morettis used the shell companies on this drive to launder the hits they took out on the Thorne family. Everything is on here. The signatures, the dates, everything." Julian stepped over the fallen commander, his suit jacket torn and his tie gone, looking every bit the warlord he was. He looked at the thumb drive in Clara's hand, then at the fire raging at the far end of the ballroom. The central conflict was no longer just about Elena's lies. It was about the survival of his empire and the vindication of Clara's father. "Elias!" Julian shouted over the roar of the flames. "Get the guests to the lower vault. Now. And find Elena. She's not leaving this building until I say so." As Elias began to coordinate the evacuation, Julian turned his full attention to Clara. The air between them was thick with heat and the smell of cordite. For the first time, Julian didn't look at her as a tool or a witness. He looked at her as an equal. He reached out, his hand hovering near her wounded palm before he gently took the drive. "You've given me the keys to destroy the Morettis for good," Julian said, his voice low and vibrating with a new kind of determination. "But you've also given me something I haven't had in years, Clara. A reason to believe that there's actually someone in this city who can't be bought." "I didn't do it for you, Julian," Clara said, her voice regaining its strength. "I did it for the man who was too kind to fight people like you. And I did it because I was tired of being invisible." "You'll never be invisible again," Arthur interjected, his hand still resting on her waist. There was a moment of profound realization as the three of them stood in the center of the wreckage. The Mafia boss, the rival rogue and the waitress. The romantic interests had reunited with a deeper understanding of the stakes. Arthur wasn't just a chaos agent. He was a man who saw in Clara a chance at a life that wasn't defined by shadows. And Julian, despite his darkness, saw a chance for a legacy that wasn't built on lies. The turning point sparked a surge of inner strength in Clara. She realized that she held the key to solving the central conflict. "The fire," she said, pointing toward the curtains. "The server room is directly behind that wall. If the heat hits the backup drives, the Moretus digital trail disappears forever. We have to bypass the main security and manually lock the cloud upload from the terminal in the kitchen." "The kitchen terminal?" Julian asked, frowning. "How do you know that?" "I've spent 3 months cleaning that terminal while the chefs weren't looking," Clara said with a faint, defiant smile. "I told you I was a ghost. I know every backdoor in this building." Hope flared in the room. The plan was set. They wouldn't just survive the night. They would dismantle the Moretti network from the inside out using the very infrastructure Elena had helped them build. Julian signaled to his remaining men to form a perimeter. "Arthur, take her to the kitchen," Julian commanded. "I'll hold the foyer. If they break through, I'm the one they want. You get that data locked and you get her out of here." Arthur looked at Julian, a silent truce forming between the two rivals. "Don't die, Thorne. I still owe you a rematch for that business in the North District." "Just keep her safe," Julian replied. As Arthur and Clara sprinted toward the service corridor, Clara felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of courage. She wasn't just a victim of Elena's cruelty anymore. She was the architect of the final confrontation. She led Arthur through the winding, smoke-filled hallways of the Gilded Heights, the familiar paths of her invisible life now serving as her greatest weapon. They reached the kitchen where the staff had fled, leaving half-finished plates and simmering pots. Clara dove for the terminal tucked behind the prep station. Her fingers flew across the keys with a precision that left Arthur staring in awe. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a master of the systems that ran this world. "Almost there," she whispered, the screen's blue light reflecting in her determined eyes. "I'm locking the Moretti accounts. I'm tagging every transaction with the digital signature of the Sterling estate. By tomorrow morning, every bank from here to Switzerland will see their money as stolen property." The turning point was complete. They had moved from defense to offense. The revelation was out, the hope was ignited, and the characters were united for the final push. Clara looked at Arthur, the heat of the nearby fires forgotten in the rush of the moment. "We're doing it, Arthur," she said. "No, Clara," he said, leaning down to press a quick, fierce kiss to her forehead. "You're doing it. I'm just the one holding the door." The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of ozone and scorching metal as the terminal hummed under Clara's frantic commands. Outside, the world was ending in a symphony of gunfire and crashing crystal. But in this small, tiled sanctuary, the war was being fought in lines of code and digital ledgers. Arthur Shelby stood by the swinging double doors, his silhouette framed by the orange glow of the encroaching fire. He was a sentinel of iron and shadow, his eyes never leaving the corridor. "Clara, we're running out of time," Arthur called out, his voice straining against the roar of an explosion that shook the foundations of the Gilded Heights. "The structural integrity of the West Wing is failing. If you don't finish this now, we'll be buried in the archives." "I need 60 seconds. Clara shouted back, her fingers a blur over the keyboard. Her hand, still stained with blood and grime, didn't shake. "The Moretti encryption is layered like an onion. I've peeled back the charities and the front companies, but the core, the direct link to the hit on Julian's brother, is protected by a secondary biometric lock that Elena must have authorized." "Then we have a problem," Arthur said, turning back to her just as a spray of bullets riddled the stainless steel prep table next to him. "Because Elena is currently being dragged toward the vault by Thorne's men." "No," Clara said, a sudden realization dawning on her. "She didn't use her thumbprint. She's too vain for that. She used a passphrase. Every event she designed for my father had a specific color palette name. It was her obsession. If I can find the one she used for the night of the hit." She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, reaching back into the memories of a time when she was just a girl watching an intern steal her life. She remembered Elena's screen, a flash of deep, bruised purple. "Midnight Aconite." She typed the words. The screen paused, a loading bar flickering with agonizing slowness, and then, access granted. A flood of documents poured onto the screen. It was all there. The Moretti family hadn't just used Elena to spy, they had used her to coordinate the logistics of their most high-profile assassinations. The charity vans had moved the weapons. The gala guest list had provided the targets' locations. The waitress had just uncovered the blueprint for a decade of criminal dominance. "Got it," Clara whispered, her voice filled with a cold, hard triumph. "I'm sending it. Not just to Julian's servers, but to every major news outlet and the international banking regulators. By dawn, the Moretti name will be more toxic than nuclear waste. Then let's get out of here." Arthur grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the terminal just as the ceiling above the ovens began to buckle. They burst through the service doors back into the main ballroom, but the scene they encountered was far from a victory lap. The grand hall was a skeletal remains of its former glory. The fire had claimed the tapestries and the piano, and the smoke was so thick it was like walking through a gray dream. In the center of the ruins, Julian Thorne stood alone, his weapon empty, facing the final remnants of the Moretti hit squad. And in the middle of it all, like a ghost of the woman she had once pretended to be, was Elena Vane. She had escaped her handlers in the chaos. She stood with a jagged piece of glass in her hand, her eyes wide and manic. She wasn't looking at the shooters or the fire. She was looking at Julian. "If I'm going down, Julian," Elena screamed, the sound echoing through the hollowed-out room, "then you're coming with me. I gave you everything. I gave you the image you wanted. I made you a king." "You made me a target, Elena," Julian said, his voice deathly quiet. He didn't even look at the gunmen raising their rifles toward him. He looked only at the woman he had intended to marry. "And you killed the only family I had left." The Moretti shooters leveled their sights. Arthur moved to raise his own weapon, but he was too far. Clara, however, wasn't. She saw the flash of the rifle barrels and the desperate, murderous look in Elena's eyes. This was the moment of the most surprising twist. The moment where the waitress, the ghost, became the shield. Claire didn't think. She grabbed a heavy, decorative brass floor lamp that had been knocked over and swung it with everything she had, not at the gunmen, but at the weakened support pillar next to them. The marble, already stressed by the heat and the earlier explosions, gave way. A cascade of stone and plaster rained down, creating a temporary wall between Julian and the Moretti assassins. The dust cloud blinded the shooters, their bullets thudding harmlessly into the rubble. "Julian, move!" Clara screamed. Julian dove through the smoke, reaching Clara and Arthur just as the final Moretti commander emerged from the haze. But the commander wasn't looking for a fight anymore. He saw the fire closing in, he saw the rubble, and he saw the look in the eyes of the three people standing against him. He turned and fled toward the shattered windows, vanishing into the night. The room grew eerily quiet, save for the crackling of the flames. Julian stood up, brushing the ash from his ruined suit. He looked at the wall of rubble Clara had created, then at the girl who had saved his life for the second time that night. "You really are something else, Clara Sterling," Julian said, using her full name for the first time. But the confrontation wasn't over. From behind the fallen pillar, Elena crawled out, her face unrecognizable from the soot and the tears. She looked at the three of them, the united front she could never be a part of. She held the shard of glass toward her own throat, a final, pathetic bid for attention. "I'll do it," she hissed. "I'll end it all right here. You'll have my blood on your hands, Julian. You'll never forget me." Clara stepped forward, moving past Arthur's protective arm. She walked toward the woman who had ruined her family, the woman who had caused so much death. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look vengeful. She looked pitying. "No, you won't, Elena," Clara said, her voice calm and steady. "Because that would require a courage you don't possess. You only know how to take things from people who are too weak to fight back. But I'm not weak anymore. And the world knows exactly who you are." Clara reached out and took the glass shard from Elena's trembling hand. Elena didn't resist. She collapsed into a heap, sobbing into the ruins of her ivory dress. The queen was gone. There was only a small broken thief left in the ashes. "Elias!" Julian called out as his lieutenant finally broke through the back entrance with a fresh team of guards. "Take her. Put her in the holding cell at the docks. She's going to tell the authorities everything I don't already know from that drive. And then she's going to disappear into a life where no one knows her name." As Elena was led away, the weight of the night finally hit them. The central mystery was solved, the antagonist was defeated, and the truth was out in the world. The Gilded Heights was burning, but as Clara looked at Julian and Arthur, she realized that the fires were also purifying. The final twist wasn't a betrayal but a revelation of character. Julian Thorne, the man of iron, turned to his rival Arthur Shelby. "You helped her," Julian said. "Why?" Arthur shrugged, though his eyes lingered on Clara. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who would sell their mothers for a seat at your table, Thorne. Seeing someone who would burn the whole table down just to be able to sleep at night. It's a rare thing. I wanted to see how it ended." "It ends with the Morettas in handcuffs or in the ground," Julian said. "And it ends with a debt I can never repay." "I don't want your money, Julian," Clara said, stepping between them. "I want my father's name cleared. I want the world to know that Sterling and Company was the heart of this city's beauty, not the shadow of its crimes." "Consider it done," Julian said, and for the first time he smiled, a genuine tired smile. "By noon tomorrow, every billboard in the city will carry his name. And yours." They moved toward the exit, the three of them walking through the cooling embers of the ballroom. Clara felt the cool night air hit her face, and for the first time in 3 years she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt solid. She felt real. She had dismantled a tyrant not with a weapon, but with the undeniable power of who she was. As they reached the street, the sirens of the fire department and the police filled the air. The city was waking up to a new reality. The Thornvane engagement was a headline that would be replaced by the Moretti collapse. And in the center of the storm, a waitress had walked away with her dignity, her legacy, and a future she could finally see. The first light of dawn began to bleed over the city skyline, turning the smoke rising from the ruins of the Gilded Heights into a soft, ethereal lavender. The sirens had faded into a rhythmic hum of distant machinery, and the frantic energy of the night had settled into a profound, heavy stillness. On the sidewalk across from the charred remains of the ballroom, Clara Sterling sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a thick wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked down at her hands. They were scrubbed clean of the soot, but the small bandage on her palm remained, a physical reminder of the moment she decided to stop being a ghost. For 3 years she had carried the weight of her father's stolen legacy like a stone in her chest. Now as the sun climbed higher she felt lighter than air. Julian Thorne stood a few yards away, speaking in low, urgent tones to a group of men in suits who didn't look like his usual enforcers. These were the lawyers, the publicists, and the fixers, the people who would transform the night's carnage into a narrative of redemption. When he saw Clara watching him, he stepped away from the group and approached her. He looked older than he had the night before, the lines around his eyes deepened by the exhaustion of betrayal. "The news cycle is already moving," Julian said, his voice quiet. "The Moretti assets are being frozen as we speak. The documents you pulled from that terminal. They didn't just expose a spy, Clara. They dismantled a criminal infrastructure that has choked this city for a generation. You've done more for the safety of these streets in one night than the authorities have done in a decade." "I just wanted the truth, Julian," Clara replied. "The rest of it, that's your world to fix." "And I will fix it," he promised. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, not the one containing the engagement ring he had intended for Elena, but a smaller, simpler one. He handed it to her. "This belonged to your father. My men recovered it from the safe in Elena's private office. She'd been keeping it as a trophy." Clara opened the box. Inside was her father's signet ring, the one he had always worn when he was drafting his most beautiful designs. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She slipped the ring onto her thumb, feeling the cool weight of it. "Thank you. Your father's name will be on the front page of every paper by noon," Julian continued. "Not as a victim but as the visionary he was. And the Sterling and Company archives? They've been restored to a trust in your name. You have your life back, Clara. All of it." As Julian walked away to handle the wreckage of his empire, another figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby alleyway. Arthur Shelby looked out of place in the morning light, his rugged features and sharp eyes better suited for the flickering gaslight of a tavern. He leaned against a lamppost, watching Clara with an unreadable expression. "So," Arthur said, his voice a low rasp. "The ghost has a name. The waitress has a kingdom. What's next for the woman who burned down the Mafia's favorite playground?" Clara smiled, a genuine, tired smile that reached her eyes. I think I'm going to go home, Arthur. To a home that actually belongs to me. I'm going to sleep for 24 hours and then I'm going to start designing again. Real designs. Not watermarked with lies. Arthur walked toward her, stopping just inches away. The tension between them was no longer a product of danger, but of a deep, earned intimacy. The North District is a mess right now, he said. People are looking for a new kind of leadership. Someone who knows the value of a hard day's work and the power of a clean conscience. If you ever get tired of drawing buildings and want to help me rebuild a neighborhood, you know where to find me. He leaned down, and this time the kiss wasn't a quick goodbye. It was a promise, a slow, meaningful connection that tasted of hope and new beginnings. When he pulled away, he tipped his cap and vanished into the morning crowd, leaving Clara with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in a lifetime. In the weeks that followed, the city underwent a metamorphosis. The fall of the Moretti family sent shockwaves through every level of society. It wasn't just the criminal underworld that was shaken. It was the politicians who had taken their money, the businessmen who had looked the other way, and the socialites who had fawned over Elena Vane. Elena's trial became the spectacle of the century. Stripped of her designer gowns and her manufactured prestige, she appeared in court as a hollowed-out version of herself. The queen was gone, replaced by a woman whose only remaining currency was the secrets she traded for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security facility, her name becoming a cautionary tale for those who believed that power could be stolen without a price. Silas Vane, the uncle who was never an uncle, vanished before he could be brought to justice. But his reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that he was never heard from again. Some whispered he had fled to the coast. Others said the Thorn Syndicate had found him first. Regardless, the shadow he cast over the city was gone. Sophie, the waitress who had found her courage in the heat of the fire, didn't return to service. With Clara's help, she opened a small community center in the South District, funded by the reclaimed assets of the Morning Star Foundation. She became a pillar of the community, a woman who taught others that being the help didn't mean being helpless. Clara Sterling moved back into her father's old studio. The dust was thick on the drafting tables and the air smelled of old paper and cedar, but to her, it was the sweetest scent in the world. She didn't hire a massive staff or seek out the biggest contracts. Instead, she took on projects that mattered: libraries, parks, and housing for the people the city had forgotten. She remained a bridge between two worlds. Julian Thorne, true to his word, transitioned much of his influence into legitimate holdings, though he remained a man of the shadows. He and Clara met once a month for coffee, a quiet acknowledgement of the night that changed them both. There was no romance there, but there was something rarer, a mutual respect born of surviving the impossible. And Arthur Shelby? He remained the unpredictable force he had always been. But every Friday night, a black car would pull up to the Sterling studio and Clara would step inside. They would drive out to the coast, far from the smoke and the secrets, and imagine a world where they were just two people, free of the names they had been forced to carry. The story of the waitress who exposed the Mafia boss's fiancé became a legend in the city. It was told in the kitchens of high-end hotels and in the backrooms of smoky bars. It was a story of justice, but more than that, it was a story of identity. It reminded everyone that the most powerful person in the room isn't always the one with the loudest voice or the most expensive suit. Sometimes, it's the one who stands in the corner, watching, waiting, and holding the truth. Clara's journey ended not with a grand coronation, but with a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had reclaimed her father's legacy, she had found a love that was based on reality rather than artifice, and she had discovered her own strength. As she stood on the balcony of her studio, looking out at the city she had helped save, she felt a profound sense of peace. The fire was over. The truth had won. And for the first time in her life, Clara Sterling was exactly where she was meant to be. My dear friends, we have reached the end of this incredible journey. Clara's story is a testament to the fact that no matter how invisible you might feel, your voice has the power to shake the foundations of the world. Before you go, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We have so many more emotional, addictive stories planned for you, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when a new journey begins. Thank you for watching, for commenting, and for being part of this community. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you find the courage to speak your truth just like Clara did. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. The world needs your light.